There is a clay tablet in London, broken along one edge, no larger than a man's open hand. For most of a century it lay in a drawer among thousands of others, unread, its wedge-shaped marks meaning nothing to anyone alive. Then, in the autumn of 1872, a young museum clerk bent over it, worked out its lines one by one, and went suddenly quiet. He had found, pressed into baked mud, a story he already knew. A great flood sent to drown the world. One man warned to build a boat. The living things gathered and carried through the water. A bird released above the waves to search for dry land. He had found the story of Noah. But this tablet was older than the Bible, centuries older. And it had been written by a people who had never spoken the name of Noah at all. The question that opened under his hands that day has never fully closed. How can two peoples, divided by centuries and by language, remember the same flood in the same shape? Which of them saw it first, and how did it reach the other? If you can feel this calm slowly carrying you off, press like before it does, and stay a while with a subscribe, but only if something in these words holds you. Tell me, if you wish, from which corner of the world and at what hour you're listening. It comforts me to think of all the others who are still awake in this same hour. The clerk's name was George Smith, and he had taught himself to read a dead language by his own stubbornness, sitting with the tablets during his lunch hours until the marks began to speak. The tablet he was reading came from the ruins of Nineveh, a city on the Tigris that had been ashen mound for 2,500 years. It belonged to a set of 12, and this one, the 11th, held a passage spoken by a man called Utnapishtim. In the story, Utnapishtim tells a traveller how the gods once resolved to wipe out mankind with a deluge, how a single voice among them warned him in secret, how he tore down his house to build a great vessel and sealed it with pitch, and how he loaded aboard his family, his craftsmen, and the beasts of the field before the waters came. When Smith reached the lines about the bird sent out over the flood and the vessel come to rest upon a mountain, he is said to have grown so agitated that he began to move about the room, unable to sit still. Here was Genesis, or something wearing its face, carved into Babylonian clay by scribes who had died long before the first books of the Bible were ever set down. What Smith had stumbled into was not a forgery and not a coincidence of a single line. It was a whole architecture held in common. Two stories from two worlds, sharing not only their subject, but their sequence, their gestures, their small and telling details. And the tablet's age refused to let the matter rest quietly. The people of Mesopotamia had been telling this flood long before the Hebrews wrote theirs down. The obvious explanation, that one had copied the other, would settle the mind if only it could be proven. It cannot, not cleanly. And in that gap between two accounts that agree too well to be strangers and too distantly to be neighbors, something else waits, patient as silt. Consider how strange the situation truly is. A story is a fragile thing. It survives only as long as someone remembers to repeat it, and every mouth that repeats it changes it a little, the way a river reworks a stone. Across centuries, across the collapse of empires and the death of whole languages, most stories are lost entirely, worn to nothing. Yet here were two that had crossed that vast distance and arrived in different lands, still recognizably the same story. Two survivors of an ocean of forgetting washed up on opposite shores, and when you laid them side by side, they matched. That match is the mystery. Not that a flood was remembered, but that it was remembered twice in the same words by people who should have had no way of comparing notes. The tablet itself gives no answer. It is only baked earth, the color of dried mud, its surface crowded with the small triangular impressions a reed stylus makes when it is pressed into wet clay and left to harden. Nothing about it announces where its story began. The scribes who made it were copyists, working from older tablets that were themselves copies of older ones still, a chain reaching back into a darkness where the original is lost. Somewhere along that chain, the flood entered the record. Where it entered the world is another question entirely, and a harder one. For now, hold in mind only this. In a museum drawer in London lay a piece of a Babylonian poem, and inside that poem stood a man on the deck of a great sealed boat, watching the water, waiting for it to fall. And in another book, written in another tongue, in another century, another man stood on another deck, watching the same water, waiting for the same fall. The two men have different names, they speak to different gods, but they are doing the exact same thing, in the exact same order, and neither book explains how the other came to know.
Smith announced his discovery in London that December, and the room he spoke to understood at once what it meant. The oldest and most sacred story of their own tradition had a twin, and the twin was older. In the weeks that followed, a newspaper raised money to send Smith back to the ruins of Nineveh to search for the missing pieces of the tablet, the lines broken away at the edge. Astonishingly, he found them. Buried in the same mound, among the wreckage of a burned library, lay the fragment that completed the flood. But the more of it that came to light, the sharper the question grew, because one detail in particular, small and specific and strange, appeared in both accounts and could not be waved away. It had to do with a bird.
The bird is what unsettles careful readers even now. In the Babylonian account, when the rains have stopped and the vessel has grounded, the man aboard does not simply open the door and step out. He waits. Then he takes a dove and sets it free above the drowned world, and the dove flies out, and finding no place to land, it circles back to him. He waits again and releases a swallow, and the swallow too returns. At last he sends out a raven, and the raven does not come back, for the waters have fallen, and there is bare ground somewhere beneath it, and the bird has found a place to rest. Only then does the man know the flood is truly ending. Turn to the other book, the one written centuries later in Hebrew, and you find the same instrument used to read the same sky. A man on a grounded vessel, releasing birds one after another to test whether the world has dried. A raven, a dove. The dove that returns because it finds no footing, and later the dove that does not return at all.
The species are shuffled between the two tellings, and the number of birds differs, and the order is not identical. This is precisely what makes the parallel harder to dismiss, not easier. A clumsy copy reproduces everything the same. A memory carried down long roads by different peoples keeps the shape of a thing while the details drift. The way a song sung in two valleys keeps its melody, though the words wander. The bird test is not an obvious idea. It is a specific, peculiar solution to a specific problem. How does a man sealed inside a boat learn whether the earth beneath the water has reappeared? And two separate traditions arrived at the same peculiar solution. That is either the deepest kind of coincidence, or it is a single thread, frayed and rejoined, running through both.
The boat carries the same signature. In neither story is it an ordinary craft. It is enormous, built in haste on divine warning, sealed watertight with pitch. That black tar that seeps from the ground across Mesopotamia and was used there for thousands of years to waterproof reed vessels. The man loads it not only with his own household, but with the living creatures of the world, so that life itself might be carried across the drowning. Then the door is shut and the sky opens. In the Babylonian poem, the storm is so violent that even the gods are frightened by what they have unleashed, cowering like dogs against the wall of heaven, weeping at the ruin of the people they made. In the Hebrew account, the tone is graver, more measured, but the act is the same act. The waters rise until the mountains are covered. Everything that breathed outside the boat is gone. And when the water falls, both vessels come to rest, not in a valley, but on a height. The Babylonian boat grounds upon a mountain the poem names Nisir, or Nemush, in the highlands to the east. The other grounds upon the mountains of a land the Hebrews called Ararat, in the same broad reach of highland country north and east of the Mesopotamian plain. Two boats, two floods, two survivors, and both boats climb, as the water sinks, onto the shoulders of nearly the same mountains. It is at this point that the reader begins to feel the ground shift beneath the comfortable idea of coincidence. One shared detail is an accident. Two might be a pattern. But the boat, the pitch, the beasts, the mountain, the birds, the sacrifice that follows, all in the same sequence. This is no longer resemblance. It is architecture. The two stories are not merely alike. They are, in their bones, the same story. After the birds, in both accounts comes the same final gesture. The survivor leaves the vessel and makes an offering. He burns a sacrifice and the smoke rises, and in the Babylonian telling the gods, who have been starving through the long days of the flood without the offerings of men to feed them, come crowding down to the sweet smell like flies to a feast. In the Hebrew telling, the language is quieter and the theology transformed, but the image survives intact, the smoke of the sacrifice rising and being received above. Even the emotional shape is preserved, relief, gratitude, a covenant that such a drowning will not come again. Two men on two mountains in 2 centuries, kindling the same fire and sending the same smoke into the same sky. Now weigh the ages. The tablets from Nineveh that George Smith read were copies made for the library of an Assyrian king in the 7th century before the Common Era, when the great collection was gathered at the palace and later burned in the fall of the city, the fire baking the clay and by accident preserving it. That library is old, but the poem it held is older than the library, and the flood within the poem is older still. The version Smith read had already been copied and recopied for centuries before the scribes at Nineveh pressed it into their tablets. The Hebrew account, by the measure of most who study these things, was set down later, after the Mesopotamian flood had been circulating in the region for a very long time. This is the fact that gives the puzzle its edge. If one of these two stories learned the flood from the other, the older teacher was almost certainly the Babylonian one. But knowing which came first only sharpens the real question. It does not answer it. Because to say the story travelled is not to say how, or through whom, or whether it began with either of them at all. The scribes who copied it left no note explaining where they had gotten it. They were not authors in our sense. They were keepers, hands in a long relay, receiving the flood from the tablet before them and passing it to the tablet after. Follow that relay backward, tablet by broken tablet, and the light thins. The copies grow older, the language older, the clay more crumbled, until you reach a place where the trail simply ends in fragments too damaged to read. Somewhere before that vanishing point, the flood was told for the first time, and the men who first told it were not copying anyone. They were remembering something. The question is what? The men who kept the story alive were not poets, but copyists, and their world can be reconstructed from the tablets they left behind. A scribe learned his craft young, in a school where he copied lists and proverbs and old poems until the shapes of the signs lived in his hand. He worked with a stylus cut from reed, its end trimmed to a wedge, and a lump of river clay kneaded soft and smooth and held in the palm. He pressed the wedge into the wet surface in patterns so dense that a single tablet might hold hundreds of lines, and when he was done, the tablet was set to dry, or baked hard in a kiln if it was meant to last. To copy the flood was to receive it from an older tablet propped beside him and press it, sign by sign, into a new one. He did not invent, he conserved. And because clay is nearly indestructible once fired, the scribe's conservation is the reason the story reached George Smith at all, buried under a collapsed palace, blackened by the fire that destroyed the city, but readable still after 26 centuries in the ground. Follow the copies backward and you leave the poem of Utnapishtim behind entirely. Before that version was ever composed, an older Babylonian poem told the flood with a different hero at its center, a man named Atrahasis, whose name means something like exceedingly wise. In that older telling, the flood is not a strange interlude, but the climax of a longer story about the gods and the making of mankind, how humans were created to do the labor of the gods, how they multiplied and grew loud, how their noise so disturbed the gods that a decision was taken to be rid of them, first by plague, then by drought, and at last by water. And through it all, one god quietly protects a single man, warning him to build a boat. The bones of the flood are already here,
older than Utnapishtim, wearing a different name. The relay stretches back further than George Smith's tablet, and the further it stretches, the clearer it becomes that the story he found was already ancient when it was carved.
There is an older layer still, and it is the oldest writing has yet let us reach. Before the Babylonians, the land between the rivers belonged to the Sumerians, whose language died as a spoken tongue thousands of years ago and survived only as the sacred scholarly language of the scribes who came after, the way Latin outlived Rome. In the Sumerian flood, recovered from a broken tablet, the survivor bears yet another name. He is called Ziusudra, a name that carries the meaning of long life, of days extended. The tablet is damaged, its beginning and end lost, but what survives is unmistakable. A king, warned by a god of a coming deluge, who builds a great boat and rides out the drowning of the world. This is, as far as anyone can presently trace, the source pool of the flood, the deepest visible layer before the water closes over the trail. And here the strangeness sharpens into something almost dizzying. The same man survives the same flood 4 times over in 4 languages,
under 4 names: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. Noah. Change the name, keep the story. It is as if a single figure had been walking through the centuries, stepping from one language into the next, shedding his name at each border and keeping everything else.
So the flood is older than the Bible, older than Babylon, old as the oldest writing itself. Which raises, at last, the question that the room in London felt in its stomach that December evening. If the Mesopotamian flood is so much older, did the Hebrews simply inherit it? Did the writers of Genesis take a story that had been circulating in their part of the world for 1,000 years or more and make it their own? There is a moment in history where such a borrowing becomes almost easy to imagine. The people who wrote the Hebrew scriptures were, for a time, carried into captivity in Babylon itself, living in the very heartland where the flood of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim was old and honored and everywhere. A conquered people, resettled among the temples and libraries of their conquerors, could hardly have avoided the great stories of that land. The flood would have been in the air they breathed. It is a clean solution, and for many who study these texts, it is the likeliest one. The story flowed, as stories do, from the older and larger culture into the memory of a smaller people who reshaped it to their own faith. But a clean solution is not the same as a proven one, and this one leaves threads hanging that refuse to be tucked away. For one thing, elements of the Hebrew flood, the very structure of the birds, certain turns of the narrative, do not always match the Babylonian version that was current during the captivity as neatly as the borrowing theory would predict. For another, flood stories of the same broad family appear in places the Babylonian exile could never have reached, among peoples who never met a Mesopotamian scribe. The borrowing explains the closeness between these 2 particular texts. It does not explain why the flood seems to rise again and again in the memory of the whole ancient world. And there is a deeper problem, one that borrowing cannot touch. Even if the Hebrews took their flood from Babylon and the Babylonians from the Sumerians before them, the chain still has a first link. Someone at the very bottom told the flood for the first time, and that first teller was not copying anyone. The relay of scribes explains how the story traveled once it existed. It says nothing about how it began. Push the question all the way down, past Utnapishtim, past Atrahasis, past Ziusudra, to the broken edge where the oldest tablet gives out, and you arrive at a silence. In that silence, someone first looked at the water and decided the world had once drowned. Whether they were remembering a thing that happened or imagining a thing that had not is the true flaw of the mystery. And there is a strong reason to suspect they were remembering. It has to do with the ground itself. In the 1920s, a spade turned up something in the ruins of Ur, the old Sumerian city near the lower Euphrates, that seemed for a moment to touch the flood directly. Digging down through the layers of the city, each layer a flaw of an older town, stacked beneath the newer ones like pages in a buried book, The excavators passed through the rubbish and brick and bone of human living, and then struck a band of clean river silt, thick and empty of any trace of people, that had been laid down by water. Below the silt, the signs of habitation resumed. It was as though the city's history had been interrupted by a great deposit of mud, a flood layer sealing one age off from the next. The man leading the dig looked at that clean band and thought of the deluge. Here, perhaps, was the physical mark of it, the very silt the water left when it withdrew, the drowning made visible in the ground. The interpretation did not survive close scrutiny, and this is where honesty must temper wonder. Flood layers of that kind were found at more than one Mesopotamian site, but they did not all belong to the same moment. Some were centuries apart. The plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates has always been a place of floods. The rivers swollen each spring with the melt of distant mountains, spilling over their banks, drowning fields and villages and reshaping the land. A civilization that grew up on that plain would have known flooding not as a single legend, but as a recurring terror, arriving and receding across the generations. The silt at was real. What it recorded was almost certainly a severe local flood, not the drowning of the whole world. But a severe local flood, seen by people whose world was the plain, might feel like exactly that. To the survivors, the horizon is the edge of everything, and when the water reaches the horizon, everything has drowned. This is the quieter, more honest shape of the flood's possible truth. Not one cataclysm that swallowed the earth, but the deep memory of a land that flooded and flooded again, distilled over centuries into a single, overwhelming story. The plain remembered its own drownings and gathered them into one. And once gathered, the story took on a life independent of any particular flood, becoming a vessel into which a whole people poured their oldest fear, that the waters which gave the plain its richness could also take everything back. If that is the source, then the flood in the tablets is true in the way that grief is true. It is the accurate memory of something real, compressed and heightened until it could be carried. There is a larger and more contested possibility, one that reaches back before the cities, before writing, into a time we can only glimpse. Two scientists studying the Black Sea proposed, some decades ago, that the sea we know today was once a smaller freshwater lake, cut off from the rising ocean by a narrow neck of land. As the great ice sheets of the last age melted and the seas of the world climbed, the theory runs, the ocean at last breached that neck and poured through in a catastrophe of water, flooding the old lake basin, drowning its shores, and driving the people who had lived along them outward in every direction. The date they proposed falls thousands of years before the first Sumerian city, a real enormous inundation witnessed by human beings at the dim edge of the age of farming. The claim remains disputed, argued over sediment cores and shorelines, and it may not hold. But it opens a haunting door. If some great real drowning did occur at the roots of the ancient world, then the flood in the tablets might not be the memory of the plain's own floods alone. It might be the echo of something far older, carried in the mouths of the scattered survivors and their children's children, until it reached the scribes who first pressed it into clay. Here the mystery widens beyond the two texts that began it, and this is the moment to widen with it. For if you leave the land between the rivers and travel outward, to the mountains of Greece, to the valleys of India, to the forests of the far north, to the islands of distant oceans, to the Americas that no ancient scribe of Mesopotamia ever knew existed, you keep finding the flood. A god or gods offended by humankind. A warning given to one chosen family. A vessel, a boat, an ark, a hollow log, a great reed raft that carries life across the drowning. A landing on a mountain when the waters fall. A new beginning for a cleansed and chastened world. The names change past all recognition. The gods change. The vessels change. But the shape holds across peoples who could not possibly have shared a scribe or a market or a common tongue. The flood is not a Mesopotamian story that spread. It is something the whole species seems to remember or to keep inventing, and no one is entirely sure which. This is the point at which the neat explanations begin to fail one by one. Borrowing cannot carry a story across an ocean to a people who had crossed into a new hemisphere long before Babylon existed. Simple coincidence strains past breaking when the coincidence is worldwide, and so the mind is forced towards stranger and larger possibilities. That there was, in truth, a time of great floods at the end of the last ice age, when the melting ice raised the seas around the whole earth and drowned the coasts where people lived, and that every culture that witnessed some part of that drowning carried its own fragment of the same vast event. Or that the flood is not a memory at all, but a permanent shape in the human mind, an image the species reaches for whenever it tries to imagine the world ending and beginning again. Either way, the two tablets George Smith laid side by side are no longer a curiosity. They are two windows onto something the whole ancient world could see,
and we can only squint at. And one man, writing in Greek long after the scribes of Nineveh were dust, tried to carry the flood across yet another border, and in doing so left a clue about how such stories survive their own translation.
His name was Berossus, a priest of Babylon who lived after the conquests of Alexander had flooded the East with Greek, and who set himself the task of explaining his ancient homeland to the newcomers in their own language. He wrote a history of Babylon in Greek, drawing on the temple records and the old tablets, and among the stories he carried across was the flood. In his telling, the survivor is called Ziusudra, which is simply the old Sumerian name Ziusudra, worn smooth by a Greek tongue. The bones are all present. The warning from a god, the great boat, the family and the animals brought aboard, the sending out of birds to test for land, the grounding of the vessel, the sacrifice at the end. Berossus even adds that the survivor, before the flood, buried the sacred writings of the world in a city so that knowledge itself might survive the drowning and be dug up again afterward.
A story about a story being saved by being buried in the ground, written by a man whose own book would survive only in fragments, quoted by later writers, the original lost.
What Berossus shows is how a story keeps its skeleton even as its skin is replaced. The flood passed from Sumerian into Babylonian into Greek, changing its name at every crossing, and still it arrived intact. This is the strange durability that makes the whole mystery possible. A story robust enough to survive the death of the language that first told it can survive almost anything, can survive so long and travel so far that by the time two versions of it are laid side by side, the road between them has crumbled away, and no one can say for certain whether they are cousins or strangers who happen to wear the same face. The flood is a survivor by nature. It has spent its entire existence outliving the tongues that carried it, which is exactly why tracing it to its source is so nearly hopeless. The road keeps dissolving behind it as it walks. Yet the two texts do not agree in everything, and their disagreements are as revealing as their echoes. Look first at why the flood is sent. In the Babylonian account, the reason is startling to a modern ear. The gods are annoyed. Humankind has grown too numerous and too loud, and the noise of the teeming earth disturbs the sleep of the divine. And so, in irritation as much as judgment, the gods resolve to be rid of the clamour. The flood is an act of cosmic exasperation. Turn to the Hebrew account, and the reason has been utterly transformed. The world is drowned not because it is loud, but because it is wicked. The flood is a moral verdict, a judgment on human corruption, delivered by a single God who grieves over the necessity. Same event, opposite meaning. The water is identical. What the water is for has completely changed. This is not the mark of a lazy copy. A scribe who merely transcribed would have carried the reason across with the rest. Instead, the reason has been rebuilt from the ground up, while the events were preserved almost detail for detail. It is as though each culture received the same footage of a drowning and wrote entirely different reasons over it, one seeing petulant gods, the other a righteous judge. The flood, in other words, is a shape that each people fills with its own understanding of what the heavens are and what they want. The Babylonians saw gods who were like powerful, unpredictable humans, capable of pettiness and regret. The Hebrews saw a single moral will behind the universe. The same catastrophe became, in their hands, an argument about the nature of the divine. And the fact that the argument could be conducted using the very same flood tells you the flood came first, and the meanings were added after, that beneath the theology lies an older, barer thing. An event stripped of explanation, waiting for each culture to explain it.
Consider next the birds, which differ in a way that rewards attention. The Babylonian survivor sends a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, 3 birds in that order, and it is the raven's failure to return that signals dry land. The Hebrew survivor sends a raven first, and then a dove, and it is the dove he relies upon, sending it out repeatedly until it returns with a fresh olive leaf and, at last, does not return at all. The instrument is the same, birds released to read the drowned world, but the choreography has drifted. And this drift is precisely what you would expect from a story carried by memory across centuries rather than copied line for line. The core survives, the ornament wanders. A song learned by ear and passed down through many singers keeps its tune while the exact notes shift. The birds are the tune shifting. Their persistence proves the connection. Their variation proves that the connection ran through living memory, not a scribe's careful hand.
So the disagreements do not weaken the case that these are 2 versions of one story. They strengthen it and they refine it. They tell us that the transmission was alive, that the flood was not photocopied from one tablet to another, but carried, retold, reshaped, absorbed into the deepest beliefs of each people who received it. It was not preserved like a specimen in glass. It was inherited like a language, spoken differently in every mouth and still, somehow, the same. And that living quality is what makes the road back to the origin impossible to walk. Every teller changed the story a little, so that tracing it backward is like following footprints across sand that the wind is already erasing. Yet, there are numbers buried in both accounts, spans of days, counts of birds, measures of the vessel. And numbers behave differently from stories. Numbers are stubborn. They tend either to survive exactly or to break entirely. And what the numbers do, when the 2 floods are set against each other, is one of the strangest details of all. What the numbers do is diverge sharply, and the divergence is more revealing than any match could be. In the Babylonian flood, the storm is brief and total. The wind and the water overwhelm the land for 6 days and 7 nights, and on the 7th, the tempest breaks and the sea grows still. The whole drowning is a single violent week. Turn to the Hebrew account and time stretches out of all proportion. The rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters prevail upon the earth for 150 days before they begin to sink. One flood is a sudden cataclysm. The other is a long, grinding submersion. If these 2 stories were copied one from the other, the copyist would have kept the count. Numbers are the easiest thing to preserve and the hardest to invent identically. Yet here the counts do not merely differ, they belong to different sacred arithmetics entirely. The 7 of Babylon and the 40 of the Hebrew tradition.
Each number heavy with its own meaning in its own culture. And this is the quiet key to the whole puzzle. The event survived, the measure of it did not. When a real thing is remembered across centuries, the shape of it endures while the precise dimensions blur, and each generation fills the blur with the numbers that mean the most to them. 7 was the number of completeness in Mesopotamia, the count of a filled and finished cycle. 40 was the number of trial and passage in the Hebrew imagination, the span of a testing. 2 peoples inherited the same drowning and could no longer say how long it had lasted, so each reached for the number that felt true and pressed it into the story like a seal into wax. The divergence of the numbers is not evidence against a shared origin. It is a fingerprint of exactly how such an origin would fade. The event solid, the details dissolving, the gaps refilled by each culture with its own sacred weights. Beneath both floods lies a memory too old to carry its own clock, which returns the question to its hardest form.
If neither text simply copied the other and both descend instead from something older, then what was that older thing, and can it ever be reached? The most careful answer is a kind of ghost. Somewhere behind Ziusudra and Atrahasis and Utnapishtim and Noah stands a first telling, an original flood story from which all the others flow like streams from a single spring. But that spring is not on any tablet we possess. It lies below the deepest layer writing has recovered, in the age before the Sumerians learned to press their language into clay, when stories lived only in the mouths of the living and left no mark that could survive them. The original flood was spoken, not written. It was carried in breath. And breath does not fossilize. We can see its descendants spread across the ancient world like the children of a lost parent, and from their family resemblance we can be almost certain the parent existed.
But the parent itself is gone beyond recovery, drowned in the same silence that swallows every word ever spoken before writing came.
This is the shape of the deepest mystery, and it is worth sitting with because it is stranger and sadder than any tale of copying. Two texts agree because they are both remembering the same thing. But the thing they are remembering cannot be examined because it was never written down. We are in the position of someone who finds two faded photographs of the same face in two different houses and knows the person was real and knows the houses are connected somehow and can never learn who the person was or when they lived or which house held their picture first. The agreement between the two floods is a proof of something we cannot see. It points with great certainty at an origin we can never reach, and the pointing itself becomes the haunting. Two survivors gesturing back toward a vanished third, insisting it was there, unable to show us its face.
The men who kept the story going never knew they were doing this. The scribe at Nineveh copying Utnapishtim's flood was not aware that his tablet was one branch of a tree whose trunk had rotted away before his grandfather's grandfather was born. He thought he was preserving a poem. In fact, he was preserving a fragment of the oldest memory his species had managed to hold on to, a memory so old it had outlived every language it was ever told in, and would go on outliving the language he was pressing it into. There is something almost unbearable in that unknowing. The keepers of the flood were carrying a torch handed to them across a distance they could not perceive, from a fire they could not see, lit by hands that had turned to nothing thousands of years before. And they simply copied on, sign by sign, in the lamplight of a doomed city, until the city burned and the clay baked hard and the torch was buried in the ground to be found again in a London museum on an autumn afternoon. How does a story live that long by mouth alone before writing ever fixes it? This is not an idle question. It is the hinge on which the whole possibility of a real, remembered flood must turn. Because if human memory cannot carry a true event across the thousands of years between the drowning and the first tablet, then the flood in the texts cannot be a memory at all, and the agreement between them must be explained some other way. Everything rests on whether a spoken story can survive that long without a written anchor to hold it. And the answer, drawn from the study of peoples who kept their histories entirely in memory, is more surprising than one might expect.
Peoples who never wrote at all have, in some cases, held on to real events for astonishing lengths of time. Along the coasts of Australia, certain communities preserved stories of a time when the shoreline stood far out from where it stands today, when dry land reached to islands that are now cut off by open sea, when places people had walked and camped were swallowed by rising water. For a long time these were treated as mere legend. Then the geologists looked and found that the sea had indeed risen and drowned those coasts. But at the end of the last ice age, thousands upon thousands of years ago, the stories, it was argued, might be genuine memories of that drowning, carried down by mouth across a span of time that beggars belief. On the other side of the world, a people living near a great crater lake told of a time before the lake existed, when the mountain that once stood there was destroyed in fire and collapse, and the geology confirms that such a mountain did stand, and did erupt, and did fall, forming the crater. Again, thousands of years before any writing reached that land. Whether every such story is truly that old is fiercely debated, but the mere possibility rearranges what we thought memory could do. If a spoken tradition can carry the drowning of a coastline or the fall of a mountain across 7,000 or 8,000 years, then the flood in the tablets is not obliged to be an invention. It could be a memory older than the cities that first wrote it down, the recollection of a real catastrophe of water, passed from mouth to mouth through more generations than anyone can count, until at last it reached a people who had learned to press their speech into clay, and who fixed it there without ever knowing how far it had already travelled to reach them. The written flood would then be only the final, visible link of a chain whose earlier links were made of nothing but breath and remembering. And the reason two separate texts agree would be, at bottom, terribly simple. They agree because they are both true. They are both remembering the same water. This is not proven, and it must not be dressed up as proof. It is a possibility, held open by the strange endurance of memory in peoples who trusted their tongues instead of their pens. But it changes the weight of the two tablets in the hand. They are no longer merely a literary curiosity, two poems that happen to rhyme. They may be the last written trace of the single oldest thing the human species has managed to remember. A real drowning at the roots of the world, still faintly visible through the layers of retelling, like a stone at the bottom of a deep and moving stream. And if that is so, then the man who first pulled that stone up into the light in modern times deserves to be remembered too, because the story cost him a great deal, and the story is not finished with him even now. George Smith did not stop at the flood tablet. Sent back to Nineveh with money raised by a newspaper, he searched the great mound where the buried library lay, and against every reasonable expectation found more of it, including the very fragment that completed the broken lines he had first read in London. He returned again and again, drawn back to the ruins by the sense that the ground still held more than it had given up. On his third journey into that country, far from home and worn down by the hard travel and the heat, he fell ill and died, still a young man, with the fever taking him in a foreign town before he could reach safety. He gave his life, in a real and literal sense, to the recovery of a story older than his own scriptures. And the tablets he could not live to read went on being read without him, joined fragment to fragment by the patient hands of those who came after, in a work of reassembly that has never entirely stopped. For the library of Nineveh did not survive intact. When the city fell, its collection of tens of thousands of tablets was smashed and scattered, and the fire that destroyed the palace baked the broken pieces where they lay. What survives is a vast heap of fragments, corners and edges and shattered middles, that must be sorted and matched and fitted together like the pieces of countless jigsaw puzzles all mixed in a single box, most of the pictures missing, many of the pieces lost forever. The flood of Utnapishtim is one of the more complete tales to emerge from that wreckage, but even it has gaps, lines broken away, words that must be guessed from context or left blank, and new fragments still surface, a piece in a museum drawer that matches a break in a known tablet, a line that fills a silence that has stood for a century. The story is still, in a quiet and ongoing way, being pulled back together out of the ruin, which means that the flood we read today is not the whole of what was written. It is what has been recovered so far. Somewhere, perhaps, in the unread heaps or the unexcavated ground, lie lines that could sharpen the picture, or complicate it beyond anything yet imagined. The tablet is not closed, and because it is not closed, neither is the question. We are still, in the most literal sense, waiting to see how much of the flood the earth will give back. Set the possibilities down side by side, plainly, and their number turns out to be small. There are only 3 doors out of this room. Behind the first door, one text copied the other, or both copied a shared written source, and the flood is a literary inheritance, a story passed by ink and clay from the older culture to the younger. Behind the second door, both texts descend from an older telling that was never written down, a spoken original now lost past recovery, and the agreement between them is the family resemblance of two distant descendants. Behind the third door, the flood is the memory of a real catastrophe of water, witnessed by human beings and carried down through so many generations that it arrived, still recognizable, in two separate written traditions. 3 doors, that is all. And the maddening truth is that the evidence we possess can't tell us with certainty which one to open, because every door, from where we stand, looks exactly the same.
The first door, the borrowing, is the tidiest, and for the closeness of these two particular texts, it may well be part of the answer. But it cannot be the whole of it, because the flood appears in places no borrowing could reach, among peoples the scribes of Babylon never touched. The second door, the lost original, must be at least partly true, because the family of flood stories is too large and too widespread to have a single written parent. Somewhere their common ancestor was spoken, not written. And the third door, the real event, cannot be closed either, because we now know that memory in peoples without writing can carry a true catastrophe across thousands of years, and because the geology of the ancient world is full of real drownings, the flooding plain, the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, that human beings certainly witnessed and could certainly have remembered. Each door is possible, none is provable, and they are not even mutually exclusive.
The truth may be that all 3 stand open at once, a real flood, remembered orally down the ages, then borrowed and reshaped in writing between cultures. The doors may all lead into the same room. Why can we not simply decide? The difficulty is deeper than missing evidence, and it is worth understanding because it is the reason this mystery has stayed a mystery for a century and a half. When 2 witnesses give the same account of an event, their agreement can mean 2 very different things, and from the account alone, you cannot tell which. It can mean they both truly saw the event, independent memory converging on a real thing. Or it can mean they got their account from the same source, a single story that reached them both. Agreement proves connection. It doesn't reveal the kind of connection. And with the 2 floods, the connection is so ancient and the road between them so thoroughly crumbled that we are left holding their agreement in our hands with no way to read what kind of connection it records. Did they both remember the flood, or did they both inherit the telling of it? The texts agree perfectly.
And their perfect agreement is exactly what makes the question unanswerable. The more alike they are, the less their likeness can tell us about its own cause.
This is the peculiar trap at the center of the whole affair. In most mysteries, more evidence brings you closer to an answer. Here, the strongest piece of evidence, the uncanny sameness of the 2 stories, is precisely the thing that closes off the answer, because sameness is compatible with every explanation at once. If the 2 floods were only loosely alike, we might reason our way to independent invention. If they were identical word for word, we might prove direct copying. But they sit in the worst possible place for our certainty, alike enough to be undeniably connected, different enough to rule out simple copying, and separated by a gulf of vanished time that hides the nature of the connection completely. The evidence is not too little, it is too ambiguous to resolve, and no amount of it seems able to break the tie. And this is why the question is not merely academic, why it reaches past the scholars and touches anyone who has ever wondered whether the oldest things we have been told are true. The flood is not a small story. It sits near the foundation of more than one of the traditions that shaped the world we live in. To ask where it came from is to ask whether our deepest inherited stories are memories or inventions, whether, when we reach back to the beginning of what we have been handed, we touch something that really happened or only something someone once imagined and everyone since agreed to repeat. The 2 tablets make that question unavoidable because they prove that at least one of our foundational stories is far older than the tradition that told it to us, and shared with strangers we never knew we were related to. What else, that we take to be uniquely ours, is in fact an inheritance from a source we cannot see? The flood opens a crack in the floor of the known past, and through the crack comes a cold draught from a room much larger and much older than the one we thought we were standing in. There is a loss folded into all of this that is easy to miss, and it is the loss the flood itself keeps trying to name. Every version of the story is, in part, about the terror of everything being wiped away, knowledge, people, the whole made world, and about the desperate effort to carry something across the drowning so that it is not all lost. That is what the boat is. It is a vessel for saving what would otherwise vanish. And the story of the boat has itself been such a vessel, carrying a memory across an ocean of forgetting so vast that the far shore has disappeared behind it. There is a symmetry here almost too neat to be accidental. A story about preserving life through a catastrophe of water has, by surviving, done the very thing it describes. It has come through. But it has come through alone, without the map of where it started, a survivor that cannot tell us the name of the country it sailed from. And one place, more than any other, shows how narrowly it survived at all. That place is the library itself, and its survival is an accident so sharp with irony that it feels almost designed. The tablets George Smith read had belonged to an Assyrian king who set out in the 7th century before the Common Era to gather into one palace collection all the knowledge of his world. He sent scribes across the land to copy the tablets of older cities, to seek out rare works, to bring back the omens and the incantations and the epics and the histories, until his library held tens of thousands of texts, the largest and most deliberate hoard of written knowledge that part of the ancient world had ever assembled. It was an attempt, in effect, to build a vessel for learning itself, a place where the accumulated memory of a civilization could be kept safe against forgetting. And within that vessel, among the incantations and the omens, sat the flood. The story of the one time the whole world was nearly forgotten, drowned, wiped clean. Then the city fell. Enemies took Nineveh, sacked the palace and burned it, and the great library came crashing down in the fire. By every ordinary measure, this should have been the end. Knowledge given to the flames, the hoard destroyed. The memory the king had tried so hard to preserve turned to smoke. But clay does not burn the way paper burns. The fire that consumed the palace baked the tablets hard, firing them like pottery in a kiln, and then the collapsing walls buried them, sealing them under rubble and earth where they lay untouched for 2,500 years. The very catastrophe that destroyed the library preserved it. Had the palace merely fallen into disuse and decay, damp and time would have crumbled the unfired clay to nothing. It was the burning that saved it. The flood story survived because the city that kept it was drowned, not in water, but in fire and ruin, and the survival of the tale of a world-ending catastrophe was purchased by a catastrophe of its own. Sit with that symmetry, because it runs deeper than a coincidence. The story of the flood is a story about how knowledge and life survive being wiped away, how a single vessel carries the seed of the world across the drowning so that everything can begin again. And the way the story itself reached us is a near-exact enactment of its own plot. A catastrophe fell on the place that held it. Almost everything was lost, but a hardened remnant came through the disaster, buried and preserved by the very forces that destroyed everything around it, to be dug up long afterward and read again. The flood survived a flood. The story of the ark was itself carried through ruin in a kind of ark, the baked and buried tablet, riding out the centuries in the dark of the mound, the way the boat rode out the water. It is as though the tale insists on demonstrating its own theme every time it is nearly lost. This is not the only place the story folds back on itself in that way. Recall the strange detail the Babylonian priest added when he carried the flood into Greek, that before the waters came, the survivor buried the sacred writings of the world in a city, so that knowledge itself might be saved through the drowning and dug up afterward when the world began again. A story about burying writings to save them from a flood, preserved on tablets that were buried and saved from a fire. The theme and the fate of the story rhyme. And this rhyme points at something about why the flood is told at all, in culture after culture, across the whole ancient world. It is the story a species tells when it is afraid of losing everything. It is the shape that fear takes when it is given words. Every people that has ever built something, cities, learning, memory, a way of life, has known, somewhere beneath the surface, that all of it could be swept away, and has needed a story in which something survives the sweeping. The flood is that story. It is the human answer to the terror of total erasure. Yes, the world can end, but a remnant comes through and begins again, which suggests at last a way of holding the three doors together without forcing them shut. Perhaps the flood is a real memory and a borrowed tale and a shape the mind reaches for all at once, and these are not three competing answers, but three layers of a single thing. A real drowning somewhere at the roots gave the story its first seed. The seed was carried by memory down the ages and spread across the world, taking root wherever people feared the loss of everything, which is to say, everywhere. And along certain roads, the road between Babylon and the people who wrote the Hebrew scriptures for one, the tale was also passed by writing, culture to culture, deepening the resemblance between particular versions. The event, the memory, and the transmission are not rivals. They are the trunk, the branches, and the grafts of one old tree. This does not solve the mystery. It cannot tell us which layer accounts for any given detail, and the original event remains beyond all reach.
But it lets the three doors stand open together, as they may in truth have always stood.
And still, at the very center, the hardest question remains exactly where it was when George Smith first went quiet over the tablet. Was there a flood? Not the small floods of the plain, not the metaphor, but a single real drowning at the root of the whole family of stories, witnessed by human eyes, remembered ever after. On that, the evidence falls silent. It permits the answer. It does not compel it. And so we are left holding two ancient texts that agree too closely to be strangers, gesturing back together towards something we cannot see, and asking a question the texts themselves seem determined never to answer. To read one of these tablets today is to feel the limits of recovery in the fingertips. The Assyriologist works not with a clean book, but with a broken object, its surface chipped, its edges gone, whole passages sheared away, where the clay cracked or crumbled in the ground. Signs must be identified one by one, and where a sign is damaged, the reader must judge from the surrounding lines what it most likely was, marking the guess so that others know it is a guess. Missing stretches are left as gaps, honest blanks in the translation where the tablet has simply ceased to exist, and the work is not finished and may never be. Tens of thousands of fragments from the ruins of that world still sit in museum storerooms, sorted and unsorted, many never fully read, many waiting for the piece that will join to them and complete a broken line. It is entirely possible that somewhere in those drawers lies a fragment that bears on the flood, a variant, an older copy,
a line that would tilt the balance between the three doors a little further one way. No one has read it yet. The mystery stays open not only because the past is far away, but because the evidence itself is not yet fully in hand. The answer, or a piece of it, may already be excavated, boxed, catalogued, and simply unread, sleeping in a drawer the way the flood tablet once slept, waiting for its own George Smith.
That is a strange kind of open question, one whose answer might be sitting in a building in the dark, uncounted. And it lends the whole matter a quiet suspense that has nothing to do with drama. Somewhere in the accumulated wreckage of the oldest libraries, the flood may still have more to say. Whether it will clarify the mystery or deepen it, no one can know until the clay gives it up. Until then, the two texts remain as they are, agreeing, gesturing backward, refusing to explain. And the land that made them offers in its own body a last and stranger kind of evidence, the kind you can stand on. For the plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates is not ordinary ground, it is made of flood. Over uncounted ages, the two great rivers, swollen each year with the melt of far mountains, have spilled their banks and spread across the flat land, dropping the silt they carried until, layer upon layer, the silt became the plain itself. The fields the Sumerians farmed, the cities they built, The very earth from which they dug the clay for their tablets, all of it was the deposited body of countless past floods. The people of that land lived quite literally on top of the drownings that had come before them. They walked on flood. They shaped flood into brick and raised their walls with it. They pressed flood, kneaded and smoothed into the tablets on which they wrote the story of the flood. There is no way to know whether they understood this, whether any scribe ever paused to consider that the clay beneath his stylus was the sediment of the same waters his poem described. But the fact stands whether they knew it or not. The story of the great drowning was written on the drowned land, in the mud the floods had left, by people whose whole world was built on water's leavings. This is the frame in which the flood makes the deepest sense, not as a single dramatic catastrophe suppressed or hidden, but as the defining truth of a place, worked so far into the ground and the memory that it could never be separated out again. The plain was born of flood, and lived in fear of flood, and would in the end be reclaimed by the shifting rivers, its greatest cities left as dry mounds far from the water that once fed them. Everything about that world was provisional, held on loan from the rivers, liable to be taken back. A civilization like that does not invent the flood as a fancy. It knows the flood in its bones because the flood is the condition of its existence. And when such a people tell of a time the whole world drowned, they are not reaching for a metaphor. They are stating, in the largest terms they have, the truth they live every day, that the water gives and the water takes, and nothing built on the water's gift is truly safe. So perhaps the question of whether there was one great flood is, in a sense, the wrong question, or at least too narrow a one. The world of the tablets did not need a single cosmic deluge to remember drowning. It was drowning slowly and repeatedly for its entire existence, and its greatest story is the concentrated memory of that endless drowning distilled into one unforgettable event. And when that distilled memory traveled, carried by trade and conquest and the long migrations of peoples, it found in every land it reached others who also knew the fear of the rising water, and who took the story in as their own because it named something they too had felt. The flood spread not only because it was passed along, but because it was true everywhere. Every people that has lived beside a river or a rising sea or under a sky that can open without warning has its own memory of the water taking what it wanted. The Mesopotamian flood gave that universal fear a shape, and the shape fit so many hands that it travelled the earth. But naming the fear does not dissolve the mystery of the two texts. It only sets it in its proper vastness. Even granting all of this, the flooded plain, the universal fear, the travelling story, the precise closeness of these two particular accounts, the boat and the pitch and the birds and the mountain and the sacrifice in the same exact order, still asks for an explanation the vastness cannot by itself provide. Two floods among the world's many still match too well. And to feel the full strangeness of that match one last time, it helps to return to where the whole story began, to two men on two decks watching the same waterfall.
Set them beside each other one final time. One stands on a vast sealed vessel of pitch-sealed reed and timber, somewhere on the drowned plain of Mesopotamia, in a story pressed into clay before the Hebrew alphabet existed. The other stands on a great ark come to rest on a mountain, in a book written in a language the first man never heard. The rain has stopped for both. The water lies flat and grey and endless around both vessels, and neither man yet knows whether the world beneath it still exists. And so each does the same thing. Each takes a bird in his hands and lifts it, and lets it go out over the water to learn whether the earth has come back. The dove that finds no footing and returns. The raven released into the emptiness. Two men, in 2 centuries, in 2 tongues, performing the same small ancient rite of hope, sending a living thing out over the drowning to bring back word of dry land.
The bird has become, over the long course of this, more than a plot detail. It has become the very emblem of the question that will not close. For one of those birds in the Babylonian telling flies out over the water and does not come back. It finds its footing somewhere beyond the horizon. On ground, the man on the deck cannot see, and it simply does not return. He takes its silence as the answer he was hoping for. The water has fallen, the world is there. But he never sees the ground it found. He only knows the bird did not come home. And that is precisely where we stand with the flood itself. We have sent our questions out over the vast drowned distance of time, searching for the solid ground where the story began, and our questions have not come back. They found something out there, past the horizon we can see, some real origin, some first telling, some drowning that truly happened. We are almost certain of it, the way the man is almost certain when his raven does not return. But we cannot see the ground they landed on. We only know they did not come home with a clear answer. The bird that does not return is the shape of every question this mystery has raised, flying out and out over the water, finding its footing somewhere we will never reach. And the tablet that holds that bird sits, even now, in a museum, under glass or in a drawer. A piece of baked mud the color of the plane it came from, its surface crowded with the small wedge marks that a reed made in wet clay before the pyramids were finished. People come and look at it. Most pass by without knowing what it is. The oldest written version of a story half the world would later hold sacred, older than the scripture it so eerily resembles, dug from the ruins of a burned library by a man who died searching for the rest of it. It doesn't look like much. It looks like broken pottery. But it is one of the few solid things in this whole affair, one of the few pieces of the mystery you could actually hold in your hand. And it is incomplete, chipped, gapped, its story broken off where the clay is gone. To read it is to read something unfinished and to know that the finishing may never come. That incompleteness is not a flaw in the tablet. It is the truest thing about the whole matter. Everything here is incomplete. The written record breaks off before the origin. The oral chain vanishes into breath that left no trace. The geology permits a real flood, but cannot confirm the one we are looking for. The two texts agree, and their agreement cannot tell us what kind of agreement it is. At every level, the evidence carries us close and then stops, the way the tablet carries its lines forward and then gives out at the broken edge. We are always left a little short of the shore, and there is a temptation when a question refuses to close like this, to force it shut anyway. To pick a door and declare it the answer, to say with false confidence that they simply copied it, or that a great flood certainly happened, or that the mind simply invents such things. Each of those closings would be a small betrayal of the tablet, which is honest enough to show its own gaps and let them stand. Because the honest position, the one the evidence actually supports, is the uncomfortable one. We know the two stories are connected. We know at least one of them is far older than the tradition that handed it down. We know the flood is remembered across the whole ancient world, in places no single culture could have reached, and we do not know why. We cannot say whether at the root of it all there was a real drowning that human beings witnessed and remembered, or only the endlessly repeated fear of drowning, given a shape and passed from hand to hand until it circled the earth. The two possibilities feel utterly different, and yet, from where we stand, they produce the identical result. Two ancient texts, agreeing, pointing backward together at something we cannot see. The mystery is not that we lack an answer. It is that the evidence we have is genuinely, permanently unable to choose between the answers, and that is a rarer and stranger thing than mere ignorance. It is a question built so that no amount of looking can settle it. What remains then is not a solution but a relationship, the particular, patient relationship a person can have with a thing that will not be known. You can hold the two floods in your mind, feel their uncanny closeness, follow the trail back through Utnapishtim and Atrahasis and Ziusudra until it dissolves, weigh the flooded plain and the rising seas and the endurance of memory, and arrive every time at the same quiet edge. And you can choose to stand at that edge rather than to pretend it is not there. The tablet, broken and honest, invites exactly that. It does not offer an ending. It offers a gap and asks you to look into it without flinching, and to let the not knowing be its own kind of knowledge. The knowledge of how far back the human story really reaches, and how much of it drowned before anyone could write it down.
How much did drown before writing came is a thing worth measuring because it dwarfs everything we think of as history. Writing is young. The oldest true writing in the world reaches back a little over 5,000 years, and the flood tablets themselves, old as they are, sit well within that span. But human beings had been speaking and remembering and telling one another stories for tens of thousands of years before the first sign was ever pressed into clay. For every year of written history, there were many years of the spoken kind, unrecorded, unrecoverable, gone. An immense ocean of human experience, lives, disasters, discoveries, whole ways of understanding the world, passed through the minds of the living and vanished without leaving a single mark that survives. Writing is a thin band of light at the very top of a darkness that goes down further than we can see. And the flood, if it is truly a memory of a real event carried from before the cities, would be a beam of that light reaching up out of the dark. One of the very few things from the immense unwritten past that managed to climb into the written age and be preserved, which raises a vertiginous thought. If one such thing came through, how many others are hidden in our oldest stories, mistaken for invention, when they are in fact memories older than any civilization we can name?
We do not know and cannot easily find out because the same problem afflicts every candidate. A story that seems merely mythic might be the compressed memory of something real, worn beyond recognition by the ages of retelling. But with the trail dissolved and the origin drowned, there is usually no way to tell the true memory from the pure invention. The flood is exceptional only in that it left two independent written witnesses whose agreement forces the question into the open. Most old stories have no such second witness, and so their possible truth sleeps undisturbed, neither confirmed nor denied. The two flood texts are like a single crack in a sealed wall, through which we glimpse how deep the room behind it might go. Behind that wall may lie a whole architecture of real memory, older than the pyramids, older than the wheel, older than the first farmed field, remembered by mouths for so long that by the time anyone wrote it down, no one alive knew any longer that it had ever been real. The flood is the one place the wall has cracked enough to see through, and what shows through the crack is not an answer but a vastness. There is a way of standing inside this that changes how it feels. Consider who we are, reading the tablet now. We are not outside the story of the flood, examining it from a safe distance. We are the latest people to receive it, the newest link in the same relay that ran through the scribe at Nineveh and the priest writing in Greek and every mouth that ever passed the story on. When a person today reads the flood, or hears it, or lies in the dark turning it over, they are doing precisely what the keepers of the story have always done, taking it in, holding it a while, handing it forward. The chain did not end when the tablet was buried. It went underground for a time and was dug up and continues, and that places us in a strange and moving position. We are the survivors on the deck now. We are the ones who received something carried across a catastrophe of forgetting so vast that its far shore has disappeared, and who cannot see where it came from, and who carry it forward anyway. The flood is a story about being handed the seed of a drowned world and being responsible for keeping it alive. And in reading it, we become the very thing it describes. The people who first told the flood could not have imagined us. They could not have known that their story would outlast their language, their gods, their cities, their entire civilization, that it would be pressed into clay, buried in a burning, dug up in a distant age by people speaking tongues that did not yet exist, and still be turning in human minds under a night sky, thousands of years after the last of them died. They only told the story and passed it on, and trusted the next mouth to do the same. That trust turned out to be justified across a span of time almost too large to hold. The seed came through. It is here now, being kept alive one more night by whoever is holding it. And the fact that it survived at all against such odds, through such disasters, is perhaps the closest thing to an answer the flood will ever give. Not an answer about whether the water was real, but an answer about what a story is, and how far one can travel, and how faithfully human beings, across every barrier of time and language, have carried the things they were afraid to lose. And so the last and hardest form of the question can be set down plainly, without evasion. Was there a flood? Somewhere behind the two texts, behind Utnapishtim and Noah, behind Atrahasis and Ziusudra, behind the whole family of drownings that spans the earth, was there a single real catastrophe of water witnessed by human eyes that all of it remembers? The most honest answer that can be given is this: there may have been. There is room for it. The flooded plain, the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, the endurance of memory in peoples without writing, all of it leaves the door open. But room is not proof, and the origin lies below the reach of every tool we have, drowned in the silence before writing, pointed at by two ancient texts that agree with one another and can tell us nothing more. The bird flew out over the water and did not return. It found its footing somewhere we will never stand. And the man on the deck, and everyone since, is left watching the flat grey water where it disappeared, knowing only that beyond the horizon there is ground, and that they will never see it.
There is one more echo between the two texts, and it may be the strangest of all because of what it is about. Both floods end with a divine promise never to forget. In the Babylonian poem, once the waters have fallen and the survivor has made his offering, the great mother goddess who had wept over the drowning of her children lifts up the shining beads at her throat, a necklace of lapis made in the shape of flies, given to her long before by the god of the sky, and she swears upon it that she will remember these days and never let them slip from her mind. In the Hebrew account, the surviving family steps out onto the drying earth, and a sign is set in the sky above them, a bow of colour after the rain, placed there as a token of a promise, that the waters will not come again to destroy all life, and that the promise will be remembered whenever the bow appears. Two endings, two tokens, a necklace of stone flies, a bow of light, and both are instruments of the same thing. Both are made to guard against forgetting. Both are vows that the memory of the flood will be kept.
Sit with the irony of that, because it is almost unbearable in its precision. Two stories that end with a solemn promise never to forget the flood, and we have forgotten almost everything about where those stories came from. We have lost the name of the people who first told it. We have lost the language they told it in. We have lost the event itself, if there was an event, and cannot even be certain there was one. The very thing the goddess swore to remember, and the very thing the bow in the sky was set to recall, has slipped through the fingers of every generation until only the shape of it remains, and even the shape now points at an emptiness. The flood took great care to insist that it must never be forgotten. And it has been, in every way that matters, forgotten. Its origin drowned as thoroughly as the world it describes. All that survived was the insistence itself, the vow, the token, a necklace of flies raised in a poem, a bow of colour in a book, swearing to remember a thing no one can any longer recall. The story kept its promise to be remembered. It just could not keep, alongside it, the memory of what it was. Return once more to the vessels themselves, because even they carry the puzzle in their timbers. Both are built to precise instruction, and both are sealed against the water with the same black pitch that seeps from the Mesopotamian ground. But their shapes, when you read the measurements, are not the same shape at all. The Hebrew Ark is a long rectangular box, given exact proportions, a great floating chest, 3 decks high, far longer than it is wide. The Babylonian vessel in the Epic is stranger. Built with its sides equal, a vast cube of a boat, its interior divided into many decks and compartments, an enormous sealed block riding on the flood. And there is a still older description, recovered more recently from a single weathered tablet and pieced out by a patient reader of cuneiform, in which the ark is neither box nor cube, but round, a colossal coracle, a circular vessel of woven reed and rope and bitumen.
The kind of round boat that really did ply the rivers of that land for thousands of years, swollen to the scale of salvation. A long box, a cube, a giant circle. 3 geometries for the one saving vessel across the versions of a single tale. The variation ought to trouble the idea of simple copying even more than it comforts it. A scribe reproducing another scribe's work would carry the dimensions across intact, the way he carried the birds and the mountain. Instead, the boat changes shape from telling to telling while keeping its essential nature. Enormous, sealed with pitch, decked, loaded with the seed of the living world, built in haste on a god's warning. What survives across the versions is the idea of the vessel, the thing that carries life through the drowning. What drifts is its form. And this is the same signature seen everywhere in the flood, a fixed heart and a wandering surface, exactly the pattern a story leaves when it is remembered and retold rather than transcribed. The boat is real enough in the memory to be unmistakable, and vague enough in the details to be rebuilt in each teller's imagination. People who had spent their lives among rivercraft each pictured the great ark in the shape their own hands knew, and pressed that shape into the clay, and the shape changed while the salvation stayed the same. Hold the 3 vessels in the mind together, the long chest, the sealed cube, the round coracle, all carrying the same cargo through the same flood toward the same mountain, and all sailing, in the end, out of the same vanished memory. They are like 3 sketches of a thing glimpsed once and never seen again, drawn by 3 different hands from the same fading recollection. No 2 agree on its outline, all 3 agree on what it did, and that is as close as the flood ever lets anyone come to seeing the original. A set of imperfect drawings of a lost thing, none of them the thing itself, all of them pointing at a shape that sank below the reach of memory before the first of them was ever made. Which returns the whole matter one last time to the man who first told it and to why he told it at all.
The man who tells the flood in the Babylonian poem is not telling it idly, and remembering why he tells it deepens everything. In the great epic, the flood is not a tale standing on its own. It is spoken by Utnapishtim to a visitor who has crossed the whole world to hear it. A king named Gilgamesh, ruler of the walled city of Uruk, who has come undone. His dearest companion, a wild man named Enkidu, who had become the brother of his heart, has sickened and died, and the king has looked on the death of the one he loved most and been broken by it, not only with grief, but with a terror that had never touched him before. If Enkidu could die, so could he. The knowledge of his own coming death seizes him and will not let go, and he abandons his throne and wanders into the wilderness, ragged and half-mad, unable to bear that he too will one day be nothing. He has heard of one man who escaped this fate, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, the only human ever granted deathlessness by the gods. And so the king journeys to the ends of the earth, through mountains where the sun sets, across the very waters of death, to find that one deathless man and wring from him the secret of how to live forever. What Utnapishtim gives him, in answer, is the flood. He tells the king the whole story of the drowning and the boat and the birds and the offering, and then he explains why it cannot help. His immortality was a single gift, given once in the aftermath of a catastrophe that will never be repeated, a one-time reward for surviving the end of the world. There is no path by which Gilgamesh can earn the same. The flood, in other words, is told to a grieving man as the reason he cannot have what he crossed the world to find. It is the oldest surviving meditation on the fear of death, and the drowning sits at its center. Utnapishtim does offer one small mercy, the knowledge of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that restores lost youth. Gilgamesh dives for it and brings it up and means to carry it home. But while he bathes in a pool, a serpent slides up out of the water and takes the plant and eats it and sheds its skin as it goes, renewed. Which is why
the story says, snakes cast off their age and men do not. The king is left with nothing and goes home to Uruk to die like everyone else, having learned that the only thing he can leave behind is the city's walls and the memory of his name.
That is the vessel in which the flood came down to us. A story about a man who could not accept that he would be forgotten, told the tale of the one drowning that granted a man escape from death. And the ache at the heart of that framing is the same ache that runs under the whole mystery. The flood is bound up, from its oldest surviving telling, with the fear of erasure, the fear of dying, of being lost, of leaving nothing that lasts. It is no accident that this is the story two civilizations preserved above almost all others. It speaks to the thing human beings are most afraid of, and it offers the one consolation that has ever really held. That even when the world ends, something comes through. That even when everything is drowned, a remnant survives to begin again. Gilgamesh could not have his deathless body, but his story survived 4,000 years, which is a stranger and longer immortality than the one he crossed the world to beg for. The night George Smith read those lines aloud in London, something shifted that could not be shifted back. In the winter of 1872, he stood before a learned society and announced that the flood of the Bible had a twin in Babylonian clay, older than the scripture it resembled, and the room understood at once that the ground had moved. Among those said to be present was the most powerful statesman of the age, the Prime Minister himself, who had come to hear a museum clerk read out a drowned poem. Such was the pull of the thing. The news broke into the newspapers and spread across the country and beyond it, and it landed in a world that had, until that moment, largely taken the uniqueness of its own sacred story for granted. Here was proof that the most famous flood in the world was not without precedent, that a people long dead had told it first, in a language no living tongue descended from, on tablets baked in the fall of a forgotten empire. For some it was a thrill, for others a quiet earthquake, a crack running through certainties that had felt like bedrock. If the flood was older than the Bible and shared with strangers, then what exactly was it? History, inheritance, or something stranger than either? The excitement was enough that a newspaper put up the money to send Smith back to the ruins to dig for the missing lines, and, against all odds, he found them. But the discovery had done its deeper work already. It had opened, in the mind of an entire culture, the same gap that this story keeps arriving at. The realization that the oldest things we hold may not have begun with us, that they reach back past the edge of what we can see, into a shared and drowned antiquity none of us remembers entering. Smith would die in the field chasing the rest of it, and the tablets would go on being read and joined for a century and more after him, and still the gap he opened has never been filled. The flood came out of the ground in 1872 and unsettled the world, and it has never entirely let the world settle again, and the land it came from is still there, indifferent to all of it, still doing the only thing it has ever done.
The two rivers are still there. The Tigris and the Euphrates still run down across the flat land they built out of their own silt, still swell with the far mountains melt, still carry their brown freight of mud toward the sea. The mounds of the drowned cities still stand dry above the plain, Nineveh among them, the earth still holding tens of thousands of tablets that have not been read. The land goes on being what it always was, a place made of flood, living in the memory of flood, its oldest and greatest story, a story of the water taking everything and a remnant coming through. And somewhere in a quiet building far from those rivers behind glass lies a hand-sized piece of that plain's own clay, baked hard in a burning, carrying the oldest written version of the story the whole world would come to share. It does not explain itself, it never has. It only holds its broken lines forward into the light of whoever is looking and lets the gap where its story breaks off remain a gap.
What is a person to do with a question that cannot be closed? The flood offers no instruction, only its own long example. It was carried faithfully across a distance no one could measure by people who did not know how far it had already come, toward a shore they could not imagine. It survived by being held, and held again, and passed on without ever being fully understood by any of the hands that held it. Understanding was never the condition of its survival. Only the holding was. And that may be the quiet lesson buried in the whole strange affair. That some things are not given to us to solve, but only to carry. That the oldest inheritances arrive without their explanations, and that a mystery kept honestly, its gaps left open, is a truer possession than a false answer would ever be. The tablet does not ask to be solved, it asks only to be received. The water in the 2 stories always falls in the end. The rain stops, the flood sinks, the vessel grounds, and a bird is sent out over the world to see whether the ground has returned. In one telling, the bird comes back, having found no place to rest, and is gathered again into the warmth of the boat. In another, the bird goes out and does not return, having found its footing on some far and invisible shore, and its silence is taken as a kind of answer, the only kind available, an answer made of absence. The dove that returns and the raven that does not are the 2 halves of every question ever asked about the deep past. Sometimes the question comes home to us, empty-handed, and we take it in again and wait. And sometimes it flies out over the grey water and is simply gone, having reached, past the edge of what we can see, some solid ground we will never stand upon, and left us only its not returning to tell us that the ground is there. 2 men on 2 decks in 2 centuries watched the same water fall and sent the same birds out over it, and one of those birds is flying still, out past the horizon of everything writing can recover, over the drowned and silent country where the story began, not coming back, and by its long silence telling us, as gently as such a thing can be told, that somewhere out there is the shore, and that we were never meant to see it, only to know that it is there.